All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Tessa McKenzie, and I am a life design educator for the social sciences here at Johns Hopkins University. And I am so grateful to be talking gap years and service years. And what do you do with that time if you're considering taking it between finishing your undergraduate degree and possibly going on to graduate school or to get a PhD? So I'm joined by an incredible panel today here. And I will let them all introduce themselves, but I'm going to give you all a shout out real quick. Dr. Jane Lutken, who is a lecturer of cognitive science at Johns Hopkins University. We have Lauren Barrett, who is an assistant director of life design at Johns Hopkins Life Design Lab, and she focuses particularly on public health. And we have Allie Hardebeck, who is one of our Emerson National Hunger Fellows, and she's at Feeding America. So thank you so much for everybody for joining. I think this conversation could not be more pertinent because it is a unique time in history, and it is a perfect opportunity to pursue unique opportunities to kind of reflect on where you've been, maybe reevaluate where you want to go next, dive into developing different skills that you don't have, or doing more of what works and less of what doesn't, and possibly have a great community impact in the process. So I will turn it over to you. And Dr. Jane, would you mind if we start with you and introducing yourself?
No, that sounds fine. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I actually took 2 gap years in my experience. My undergraduate degree is from Whitman College. It's a liberal arts college in the Northwest. And after that, I was a teaching assistant in France under the teaching assistantship program in France, which is part of the Fulbright scholarship program. And then I went and got a master's from the University of Newcastle. And after that, I took another gap and worked at the public library in my hometown before starting my PhD at Johns Hopkins. That's my journey so far.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing. And Allie, would you mind if we go to you next?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Allie Hardebeck. I graduated from Hopkins last spring in 2020 with majors in public health, sociology, and a social policy minor. Like Tessa said, I am currently using this year to serve as an Emerson National Hunger Fellow with placements at the Oregon Child Development Coalition and currently Feeding America. And this coming fall, I will be starting my Master of Public Policy at the University of Chicago.
Great to have you. And Lauren Barrett, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about yourself and kind of your unique life design perspective on this entire conversation.
Sure, yeah. So it's nice to be with you all. I'm Lauren. So I graduated from Gettysburg College in 2009, so following the financial crisis and the Great Recession. So, I think the class of 2009 can really empathize in a lot of ways with the class of 2020, where, it was the unknown, right? As things start to fall away and opportunities change and shift, and what you expected to be on the other side of college all of a sudden is not what the landscape looks like. So I ended up taking a gap year, but I like to think of it as I fell into the gap. It was a surprise. I didn't plan to take this gap year, but because of the shift in circumstance, right, all of a sudden options were different. I was looking at the world a little bit differently. So I did a gap year, and I did a Outward Bound instructor course in the Pacific Northwest to explore and see if outdoor experiential learning as a career was for me. And ultimately, the following summer, so summer of 2010, I returned to do a master's in education and school counseling at Loyola University, Maryland. And yeah, I think that, there's different kinds of gap years, right? There's falling into the gap, there's the surprise gap, there's, building that bridge and kind of seeing forward. Okay, I know that there's a gap between where I'm standing and where I want to go. How do I build forward and make this a generative process? But also, how do I, if something challenges me, or if something is unexpected, or I don't have the right building materials for that particular bridge, how do I demonstrate resiliency? How do I make the most of an experience? And how do I use it in order to better understand the direction that I'm headed. Apologies if there's sound in the background. I don't know if y'all can hear that, but it's a construction team, so apologies. But yeah, sorry, lost my train of thought.
Sorry, did my internet just die? I
But you're
apologize.
back.
I hope my face wasn't stuck like this.
It's all good. I feel like that was just like you and me both being like, oh. So yeah.
It's perfect. Thank you. Your perspectives are also incredibly valuable. And one of the reasons I am grateful to be here is because I was really fortunate to do a gap year as well with AmeriCorps, where I did basic needs caseworking for Catholic Charities of Pittsburgh. And then I also was able to do refugee resettlement caseworking with Jewish Family and Children's Services of Pittsburgh. So grateful to be a part of this conversation. And it's very clear that we have opportunities here that are state, that are local, that are national, international. Would love to hear a little bit more about your own unique experiences with those programs, and what some of your greatest takeaways were here. So if we could stick to that same order, Dr. Jane, do you mind if we start with you?
Oh, that's fine. I think so. Again, I had two different kinds of experiences. And actually, my second one, I will say, was more like what Lauren was talking about, fall into the gap scenario. So I did plan to do my first one, my teaching experience. And that one is with a program, the Fulbright program. And that was a wonderful experience for me because it did give me a chance to live abroad, to experience life as an adult. Like, you're an adult when you go to college, but you're an adult in a different way when you're out of college. And when you're an adult in another different way when you're living in a different country, right? So so that was kind of a lot all at the same time, I will say that. It was a huge learning experience, a very steep learning curve, because I did speak French when I went to live in France, but it was, again, ramped up a level, I would say, to have to, figure out how to set up a bank account and all that kind of stuff. In a different language. So that was a huge learning experience for me. It was big steps in my personal development. And I do think that I would not have continued on the path that I chose if I hadn't done it. Because basically what happened was I realized I was really fascinated by how people learn language. And I wanted to learn more about that. And so that's why I then pursued my master's and eventually my PhD in this topic. I'm interested in how language is learned, right? So that really just got me going in the way that I then continued, right? It got me to where I figured out what I'm really curious about and what I don't get bored of studying, right? So I think I'll stop with that one unless you want me to keep going, but I'll pass it on otherwise.
Perfect. Go
Sure.
for it.
Yeah, I'll first explain a little bit more about the program that I'm currently involved with. So the Bill Emerson National Hunger Fellowship is sponsored by the Congressional Hunger Center, and the goal is to provide a group of young leaders who are interested in working to end poverty and hunger in the United States an opportunity to have really valuable experiences both on the local level with more community-based organizations and on the national level with larger nonprofits or government agencies. So I learned about Emerson from actually another Hopkins alum, as it turns out, when I was interning my summer before senior year at the Brookings Institution. A current Emerson fellow who had graduated from Hopkins was doing her policy placement there. So I learned about the program there, and I was interested in applying for the coming year, for my first year after I graduated. When I was considering my postgrad options, I honestly wasn't really thinking about the fellowship as a gap year. I knew that grad school was something that I was interested in my 3 to 5 year plan. And frankly, up until the middle of last summer, I was still pretty set. I'm going to get a few years of experience, see how things go from there. But due to a few different factors and the pandemic and all sorts of things, I decided that I was ready, and this was the time to pursue grad school. But just to plug Emerson, because I know not everyone who's watching is thinking about public policy programs or something within that sphere. But I will say that people in my cohort are going to med school next year, law school, public policy programs, public administration. So an experience like this where you not only get to work with one organization for the year, but kind of have this local and national perspective on policy, and not just anti-hunger issues, but also could be anything from housing to economic development to anti-poverty work, more generally speaking. It is a really, really valuable experience, and can really set you up with a great network coming out of the fellowship that will extend beyond your time. So I think I'll stop there. But
awesome. What about you, Lauren?
So I was thinking about something that Dr. Jean said, and I can't remember your exact phrase, but taking the time and space to really truly understand what it is you want to do, like what is your next step. And I think that really, when you said that, it really resonated with me, because I had ideas about what I liked and the skills that I enjoyed using in some way, shape, or form, but really hadn't thought, how do I apply these and, create a career for myself? How do I take the things that I enjoy doing and apply them to do meaningful work, especially in, a context of seeing a lot of shifts within the economy at the time. So, choosing, like I had an incredible amount of privilege in the choice that I made. I worked the entire summer at an outdoor summer program, and I think I made $2,000 for the summer, and I took that $2,000 that I made and I put it towards this Outward Bound Leadership Instructor course, because I wanted to see if the group facilitation that I enjoyed doing with, children in a day camp context could translate to expeditionary learning. And what I found through that experience was really that I loved group facilitation with people who were trying to work through and move through processes together. And I wanted to be able to do that continually with folks, to build relationships, to have challenges emerge, and to be able to process them in an ongoing way. And ultimately, that led me to this master's in school counseling because of the group facilitation component, right? So like taking this idea of, I know I love to talk with people. I know I love groups. I know I like seeing relationships develop over time and seeing how people change and grow as, time passes and events go on. So I think that taking the year and really understanding school counseling was not something that I ever even thought about before that point. But, the people that I met in my Outward Bound instructor course, there were only 10 of us. So I got very close, spending 2 months outside with 9 other people. And, learning from them about the potential opportunities that I might engage with in the future. Ultimately, like I wouldn't be where I am today had I not done that. I never would have been exposed to it. It never even would have been the spark of an idea. So, coming full circle right to that, cultivating your true interests. Like I took a chance. I had no idea if Outward Bound would hire me after that course. I wasn't sure, what the next step was, but I knew that I needed to immerse myself in what this experience might feel like, and see if I really loved it as much as I was saying I did. So yeah, it gave me a chance to cultivate that. So.
Awesome. So in terms of the skills that, I heard a whole lot of, this gave me an opportunity to develop certain skills. Are there certain skills that you felt like positioned you for success in those spaces, or certain skills that you would recommend? We have 22 people here that are joining us, and I'm wondering if you could kind of recommend to them, these are some skills that you're going to want to develop or to practice to lean into if you're pursuing these gap year opportunities. What would those skills be?
Wow. There are a lot, actually. I mean, and they're mostly not what you expect them to be, right? So like, obviously I learned French, right? Like that's, yay. And that's relevant to me because I am a linguist and that's part of what I work with, but it's not the main thing. Actually, the first thing I thought of is that when you're in academia, right? And honestly, not everybody here might be considering going into academia. Really, obviously you can do a master's degree or a PhD and then not continue in academia. But once you're in academia in any kind of way, you get kind of an odd sense of what is important in a weird way, right? So you can be told like, oh, this deadline, you've got to make this deadline. It's really important. And I remember when I first started my PhD, someone told me, if you don't get these grades done by day after tomorrow, it will be really bad. And because I had had these other experiences, I had a better perspective of what really bad is, and that I think is actually a very important thing for people as people to be able to kind of modulate, so like I could say, well, what is really bad? Will Johns Hopkins stop running and everybody will, it'll all be over with? Probably not. Like I had a kid get bit on the eyeball by a snake. Okay. Like that was an adventure I won't go into, but that was really bad. Right. And so that's the kind of skill I think is actually something I didn't have on my list of things I needed to learn, post my undergrad. But doing this kind of other job can give you a good perspective, right, on what is important in your life, right, also, and in the general world too. So like what is something that you really care about is something that you can learn this way. Again, kind of echoing Lauren, also echoing Allie, like what are the things that you find really important is an important thing to learn. And that's something I definitely figured out in great part because of my gap years. And then also you learn, I think, I learned better how to deal with just the kind of everyday interactions with people, that I think a lot of folks who wind up in my, at least, corner of academia maybe don't have these skills as much as I think people who have taken a gap year do. And I'm talking about things like just like public relations type stuff. If you're in a position where you're having to, everybody says deal with the public. Deal, I think, is a loaded word, but interact with the public, right? If you're in a position, if you're a teacher, which is what I was, or a librarian, which is what I was, people come and they have questions for you and they expect you to solve problems. And you have to learn how to do that for them with respect and with, kindness, and in a way that it's very easy to lose your temper. And there's often no reason to do it, right? But that's another skill I learned. Over to the next one.
Great. Yes. And building on that sort of public relations piece, the one thing that comes to mind for me that is super essential before grad school, during, after school, career, whatever, is becoming comfortable with being really proactive about building relationships and reaching out to making connections. So anytime I was making a decision about any, opportunities, whether it was deciding between internships or even, thinking about what courses to take in school and trying to get a sense of what my options would look like post-grad as well, I am definitely someone who puts a huge emphasis on building those relationships and, trying to get feedback and hear about other people's experiences. And I know that networking is definitely a loaded word too, and a lot of people are resistant because they feel that it can be very transactional. And I think it can be if you go into every conversation in a kind of aggressive way, like with an ask all the time. But I think kind of reframing that to be just, trying to gather information that will help you develop a clear understanding of what you're looking for. That was so essential to me as I was deciding whether or not to apply for this cycle, deciding whether or not to do Emerson versus other opportunities post-grad. That's something that will always be important and it will always serve you. I think an underrated thing too is kind of maintaining those connections. I definitely still keep in touch, even if it's just a brief email with professors from freshman year, with, people that I worked with on one project. And I definitely maybe go a little above and beyond what you need to kind of maintain those relationships, but just keeping track of who you've interacted with, I think, can be super important and helpful as you're, planning a next move, especially as it pertains to grad school. And although I wasn't applying to PhD programs, my understanding is that, reaching out to specific faculty members, that's something that definitely is relevant in that process. The other, not necessarily skill, but more of a mindset, I think, that is super important to cultivate is intentionally putting yourself in situations where you're forced to kind of build this resilience and react to circumstances that aren't fully within your control. I think for me, my fellowship was a great opportunity to do that, because in normal non-pandemic times, for the first half, the field placement portion, you would be sent to work with an organization somewhere around the country. And although we were not required to be there in person, although I did have the opportunity to live in Oregon for a few months, not having full control over those circumstances, I think, was something super valuable. Just, learning how to go with the flow a little bit more, because that's definitely not how I am wired by default. So, having those situations built into, a program or other structure where you have that external support is super valuable. So you're not, totally wilding, but you have that support structure, but you also, get to be pushed out of your comfort zone a little bit.
For sure. I feel like so many things the two of you said resonated. Definitely, Dr. Jane, what's a crisis, right? Like determining what a crisis is. And Allie mentioned building resilience through these unexpected circumstances, like being able to stop and take inventory and be like, all right, what can I control? Like living outside, you're like, no, it's snowing. I have to react to this. Like I have to, because my survival mechanism says, oh, if you don't, find a camp and eat and get warm and check in with your community members, like here's what will happen next. So definitely, being able to stop and take inventory of a situation. I think there were two things that stood out to me right away. The first was telling my parents. I think that if you are telling your parents that you're going to take a gap year and like, oh, I'm going to try something, or I'm going to do this outside of the box, thing, or I plan to go back, I promise. Or in my case, I just said, I'm not sure what to do next. So I'm going to do this. And that's the choice that I'm making. And, it was a surprise to them, and certainly an adjustment for them to make. And this is at a point, this is going to age me, but like I didn't have an iPhone, but like I was like, I won't have a phone for 2 months. You won't be able to contact me. I'm going to be out in the field. And they were like, well, what does this mean? What are you going to be doing? What will you learn? How will we know if you're going to be hurt? And at some point, right, communicating with them and saying, I'm going to choose my choice now, and here's the information I can give you. And the rest truly is adventure, right? Like it just is. So telling your parents and feeling like you have information and setting that boundary in some ways, and being able to say, this is, the choice that I'm choosing, and I'm being responsible and thoughtful, et cetera, about it. But it is different than what you planned or you saw for me, but this is what I see for myself. So navigating that and learning that it's okay to be lost. I think that was one of my biggest takeaways. And that, clearly, so I got a master's in K through 12 school counseling. Clearly, that's not the role that I'm in right now. There were many times where, both on Outward Bound and throughout my career, I've had to stop and kind of triangulate and say, okay, where am I on this map? Am I still on a path? Is that okay? What can I see from where I am? Do I hear running water? Do I see a peak? Like taking inventory of the landscape around you and saying, like, I might not be on the traditional path anymore, but I know where I am. I think I can pick out where I want to head next. So, you know, after I completed my master's, I didn't go into a traditional K through 12 school counseling space. I started my own business. I became a sole proprietor and an educational consultant. And I never, again, never would have foreseen that. But what I said to myself in the moment was, you know, if I could do this outward bound, like if I survived 50 days doing this work, I can figure out how to do this thing next. And so really that deeply instilling the confidence to make bold decisions. And I think that I've enacted that throughout my career. And it started in that gap year where I was like, here's what I could do, but here's what I'm going to do instead. So having the confidence to make those decisions and the resilience to work through it when, you know, they unfolded in surprising ways. So yeah, lots of skills.
Lauren, I love how you just talked about that, the idea of taking stock in what's around you and that comparison with nature. And I know you come from a life design background, but absolutely, I feel like what I'm hearing are those same themes that we hear and kind of Designing Your Life by Dave Evans and Bill Burnett, and that we kind of preach in our office, that idea of following your curiosity, meeting people, and then having experiences. And you might have heard our vice provost of integrative learning and life design, Farouk Day, talking about audacious moves, kind of a risk taking. And I think we all, especially in this past year of a pandemic, recognize that a whole lot of life is improvisation. So it's essentially learning those skills to be able to pivot when the unknown happens, because inevitably it's going to happen. So it's very clear that y'all have practiced that pivot long before now, and I think it makes it that much easier. You're that much more able to be flexible when the surprises of life inevitably occur. I wanted to piggyback off of what Lauren was just saying. Thank you for taking us through that journey of how you then got to that place of seeking out graduate school. And for Dr. Jane and for Allie here, wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about then how did that experience, these experiences, kind of position you to then commit to further education? What was that moment? What was that process? How did you get to that space of knowing what to do next? And did you know what to do next?
That's what I was going to say. I never know what to do next. So I think two things. First, I did, like I think I said earlier, I did figure out what, because I've always been somebody who, like, I kind of thought I was going back to school. I do wish, side note, I wish that there had been more options presented to me before I kind of launched off into the world. But I kind of always knew I was going to go back to school, but I didn't know what for. So my first gap year, I did have this like, oh, this is the thing that I think is amazing. I think this is so cool. Does anybody study that? So then I had to like go and figure out, well, there are actually a lot of different ways that you can study. How people learn isn't a field, right? So like you have to, figure out what's the best path for you in that. I do want to say that so I got my master's first, right? And I went and I thought it was a terminal master's program. I thought all I want to know is how to teach language, right? That's the part of this that fascinates me. And then in doing that master's, like, nah, I don't want to teach language. I think this process is what's cool. But I also had already, and this is something I hope everybody, this is like, if I can ask you to take away anything from this, people who are listening, it's this. I knew that there was the possibility that there were all these other jobs that might bring me joy, right? And one of them was being a librarian, okay? And so I decided that I would be a librarian first and see if that would fulfill me, right? And, I was lucky in that I then got that job. And I hope Tessa comes back. And so I could try that out. And in doing that, I did love being a librarian. I thought it was great, but it didn't kind of satisfy my desire to be constantly curious and doing research and teaching directly. That it didn't check all the boxes for me. And if someday I wind up being a librarian again, that might be fine, right? But doing that helped me figure out, no, I won't be happy just being a librarian. What I need to do is something that will also let me do research, that will also let me teach. And the reason I hope people will remember this idea of, let's try, if there is something else, right? It makes more sense to try that first before you launch into a PhD, okay? Because, I mean, I can talk about PhDs later, but they're like, not to do just because you can't think of another thing to do, right? So there was so part one was I figured out what I was really curious about. And part two is I figured out that doing this other thing that I thought I might like was not enough. And that I needed this other aspect, this research aspect and teaching aspect to be like kind of fulfilled.
Yeah. So I can speak a little bit to how I sort of got on the path to consider grad school for me. Early on in my undergraduate years, I definitely wasn't set on any sort of graduate program. It wasn't until the same internship at Brookings where they would have different info sessions for public policy programs that, you know, all the interns would go to for free food and drinks and to take a little break during the workday, that I started thinking, okay, this is actually sounding really cool. I had just finished my social policy semester and I was super jazzed about all of the different skills I was building and different issue areas. And that semester was definitely the one where the coursework reflected my interests most deeply. And I began thinking, okay, you know, maybe this is an area where I need to build with additional education. It was something I was considering a little bit further in the future, but eventually, as I was progressing on in my senior year, I was working on my sociology honors thesis, and I was really enjoying it, but I also had this moment where I realized that I didn't feel as comfortable with more of the quantitative skills and, you know, other aspects of research to the extent that I wanted to be. And although I'm still figuring out for my post-grad school plans if the jobs I'll be interested in have more of that research quant bent or more, you know, qualitative, for lack of a better word. But I knew that I was really interested in having that strong skill set, so I would have the option to pursue those roles as well. When it came to this past summer, I had reached out to the Life Design Lab, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna get my resume squared away. I'm prepping for the GRE just to kind of have it in my back pocket. But it wasn't until later in the summer that I was, you know, thinking about the fact that the program I was about to do would be a combination of two different experiences. The one thing I had always been a little bit hesitant about going straight from undergrad into grad school was not having enough of those professional work experiences to apply grad school coursework to. So that was something I had been concerned about. But as I was figuring out those plans, I felt more confident that a year would be enough to be able to make the most of my time in grad school. So it was really that summer where I was thinking, you know, of course the pandemic played a role. I think it's also important to think of the geographical considerations. So I'm originally from the Baltimore area. I was at Hopkins for 4 years. I know that this is the city where I want to return to and do this work, but I also recognize the value of having experiences in other cities and places, whether it was jobs or for school. So that was one of the other huge draws of Emerson, you know, having that field placement somewhere around the country and then 6 months in DC as well. But when I was just thinking, okay, a year of Emerson, do I move back to Baltimore? Do I go somewhere else? I realized that I really just wanted to dive back into school, start building those skills early, because I did feel confident in the path that I was taking. And And I think it also depends on the program. For something like an MPP, you don't need to specialize into anything immediately or at all. So, it depends on the program, but having that option is a great thing as well. You don't need to, commit to any specific issue area, and there's still time to explore.
Wonderful. And I know, Lauren, we kind of started with you in an inverted sort of way there. But I'm wondering if in particular, Lauren, you could share as a life design educator. I think Dr. Jane and Allie brought up several really great points in regards to the considerations of taking that next step. What other considerations weren't mentioned, or would you double down on that you've heard that when a student comes to you and says, I'm thinking of graduate school, I'm thinking of a PhD, what are some of those other questions that you're asking to make sure that they're making the right choice, if there is a right choice?
I was going to say there are so many right choices. There's so many. It's almost like there are no wrong choices, right? There are just choices, and each one sets you up for, maybe a path that you expect and maybe a path that you don't expect. So it very much, like, you don't like to hear that when you're thinking about making a plan. You're like, okay, I'm making a plan because I want to know where I'm at and I want to know what happens next. But, with each decision comes people that you meet and experiences that you have that change and transform you. And, and then the elements that are outside of your control, just how our world, changes around us. And, tomorrow you could encounter something that inspires you, changes your direction, lights up that part of your brain that says, oh my gosh, this is the work that needs doing in the world. And I want to be the one that does it. I think that I will echo Dr. Jane in that, trying, if there's something in your mind that you're like, I think I could see myself there. I can visualize myself trying this out, or making a career out of it, finding the opportunity, whether it's, like I said, there are no wrong choices. So if you're forging your own path, then trying that thing is an integral part of your story. In order to avoid the regret, right? Like, you don't want to look back and say like, oh, I wish I had tried, right? And sometimes there are things that you'd really like to try and now is not the right time. And that's okay too. Being able to say, all right, Dr. Jane, if you hadn't been able to do it then, finding a space to volunteer at a library or to, tap into those passion areas. But if you've got something in your mind where you're like, oh man, I could see myself there. I can feel those, those vibes when I'm in that space. And, but it doesn't quite fit, or it doesn't look like what I've set myself up to do. Try it anyway, right? Like, trust your instincts, trust your gut, because a lot of times those vibrations, like, they're trying to communicate something to you. And, I think that confirming for yourself, like, yes, this is right. My intuition was right about this, or wow, my intuition, told me to try. I learned something from that. And that makes it even, I feel even more confident and encouraged in, the pathway forward. I talk with a lot of public health and pre-health students about whether or not, they want to go into medicine or they want to become doctors. And, the whole point of an undergraduate, like, liberal arts degree is to explore, right? To be able to try different things. And it's okay if you started out thinking you were going to do one thing and then you choose an experience to try another thing, and that becomes, that becomes the path that you've stepped onto. So I think, if particularly before committing to, a PhD or medical school or something that, has this incredible investment of time and, financial and is going to really guide the next step in your career, trying those things out is my biggest recommendation. Did I answer your question, Tessa? Was that...
Super helpful. Absolutely. When I wanted to mention too, one thing that when I'm talking with students and to go on to further education, the idea of the network that is part and parcel to that school is something I know. Allie, I want to thank you because you gave a shout out to the Life Design Lab. And also you mentioned the social policy space at Hopkins, two programs that I know we try very intentionally to support strong networks and to connect students to alums and employers. So that is something that when you are considering that graduate degree, that PhD, absolutely take a look at who is graduating from these programs. Where are they going to work? Where are they doing research? Who will you potentially be connected to as a part of that kind of family looking out for each other? And to kind of build off of that with Allie's point, I'm wondering, and specifically, I think Lauren and Allie, maybe you could speak to this, but at Johns Hopkins, what are some of those resources that are available to folks that are interested in building those networks, to maybe taking similar paths to yourselves? What resources should our students be accessing to become embedded in some of these spaces that they're hoping to lean into post-graduation? Why don't we start with Allie, if that's all right?
Yeah, absolutely. What immediately comes to mind that's most pertinent to the idea of considering a gap year is the fellowships office. So they were so helpful to me while I was preparing my application for the fellowship, during the multiple rounds of interviews and that entire process. They keep records and collect data based on previous students applying. So I was so prepared for each step of the process and was able to read past year's essays, and they had a good idea of like how each interview would be structured. So that was phenomenal. That was extremely helpful. I definitely want people to encourage people, even if they're not sure if there's a specific program that they're interested in, to just go to office hours, walk in person, virtually, however things are happening these days, to kind of start those conversations. Because then once you're building relationships with the folks in that office, if different opportunities are made available to them through their networks, they can always reach out to you, and it's something that's on their radar. But as far as other things at Hopkins, obviously, like I said, the social policy minor was a hugely formative experience. And actually, I'm out of town right now with my friends that I made through the social policy minor. So that's just a fun addition. So do the social policy minor, you might make some best friends as well. But another thing that I think could look different depending on what your interest area is, one thing that was super helpful for me during undergrad, starting from pre-orientation, Habitat Prio, I was super involved in Habitat for Humanity. And as I became more involved in leadership positions in our chapter, eventually towards my senior year, we were kind of ramping up our advocacy efforts. And right before the pandemic hit last spring, I was able to attend Habitat on the Hill, which is our Habitat's week of advocacy and congressional visits and all of those good things. So that was a really interesting opportunity for me to expand my network beyond Hopkins and Baltimore, but with people who were passionate about affordable housing, similar to me. So I'm not exactly sure what that involvement looks like for different spaces, but thinking about the clubs that you're currently involved in, are there local, regional, national opportunities to meet people with different interests? I mean, that really allowed me to build strong relationships with our Habitat affiliate, Habitat of the Chesapeake, and expose me to different types of careers and jobs that I hadn't considered in kind of this state and local advocacy that you might not be aware of just, taking classes at Hopkins. So thinking about what you're already involved in and kind of expanding from there.
Echo Allie in that, searching for alumni. So, you could use LinkedIn or OneHop as a resource to search for alumni who are, in fields that you're interested in, et cetera. And sometimes our instinct might be like, oh, here's a job that I want to apply to at X company. Let me search LinkedIn and see if any alumni work there. I would say, instead of doing that, right, searching for alumni who were part of organizations that you were part of as a student, finding those people who, maybe 3, 5, 8 years ago were social policy minors, and exploring, where are they now? What were the sparks that were lit in doing this work that, sent them on this journey, and having the opportunity to reach out to them through one of those platforms and say, I'd love to talk about, your bridge building. How did you get from, this point to this point? And using that not as a tool to, build your own path, but as like part of the puzzle. Like, oh, maybe they engaged in an experience or built a relationship or, tried something that failed, and hearing that story, resonates with me, and it becomes part then of how I'm thinking about decisions that I make and experiences that I choose to engage in. So I think that, alumni from student organizations can be a powerful catalyst, for future opportunities, whether or not they transform into like leads for jobs, which sometimes they do, but just building relationships with a broader alumni network and saying, we enjoyed the same thing as college students. I bet that there's something that still resonates there, and taking a chance to reach out and do an informational interview and better understand, who they are in their journey. I definitely agree with Allie too. The fellowships office, for those formal gap year opportunities that provide funding and have, a foundational structure and a community attached to them. I would also say, Handshake, there are gap year opportunities. Like, I'm thinking of Project Horseshoe Farm. This is one of the ones that always comes to mind, where it's like, here's a formal 1 year, a 12-month gap year opportunity in a public health setting, a rural public health setting. And those opportunities do exist on Handshake, but sometimes they're not labeled as gap year, or they're not, intentionally specific. They might just be, positions that are designed to be short term, or to be for learning foundational skills, where it's anticipated that maybe 2 years in, you might be exploring the next step in a field. So I think utilizing, Handshake and meeting with a life design educator to discuss, how will I find those opportunities? How do I find, the needle in the haystack that is these, these specific types of opportunities on Handshake. So yeah. And Allie, I love that you went on Habitat Prio. I went on at Gettysburg, which is where I did my undergrad. I went on the outdoor pre-orientation trip, and my Prio leader actually now works at Hopkins, and I co-lead the experiential education leadership tracks with him every spring. So like, those relationships from Prio, for real, they're some of the foundational ones, because they're the first people you meet at school. So like, stay in touch with your Prio community, everybody on the call. You never know how that will unfold.
Thank you so much. I want to be mindful of time here so that folks have a chance to head over to the next, and I believe final event for Grad Camp 2021. But thank you, everybody, so much for your time and your insight here. I wanted to mention real quick, to accompany that conversation, please get to know the folks at the Center for Social Concern. They are here for you. They have your back. Pre-professional advising is also a great place to go for further resources. And I'm a big fan of the website serviceyear.org as well. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And I wanted to just ask the group real quick, if folks want to continue this conversation, is LinkedIn a place where we can direct them to contact you? Wonderful. Thank you so much. And if y'all wouldn't mind, supporting this group with a virtual round of applause, we're so grateful for your time. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thanks. Nice to meet y'all.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you.